Hey everyone, thanks for joining me. Today I'm joined by Parmeshwaran Iyer, also known as Pi. Pi is currently the Chief Supply Chain Officer at Apollo Tyres and has previously held senior leadership roles within Beiersdorf across a number of geographies. Pi, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Sam, for having me.
Yes, first things first, I'd love to just get a bit of an introduction to yourself. Could you tell me a bit about yourself and your career journey?
Good. As you already said, my name is a bit of a tongue twister, so I prefer to go by the moniker Pi. And I'm a hardcore supply chain professional, over 31 years of supply chain experience across various industries. I started my career way back in '94 as a trainee. I used to work for a Japanese company which was manufacturing air conditioners. And then I moved from there to an oil company, Total Oil. I was in the manufacturing unit responsible for the planning and materials management. Back in the day, supply chain was called materials management. Post that, I joined Johnson & Johnson in the medical devices division. I worked with them for close to 6 years before being headhunted by Beiersdorf, or formerly in India, it was called as Nivea India. So I started my journey in Beiersdorf way back in 2006, and I spent close to 19 years across various geographies, various roles, headquarter role, regional role, bigger markets. So I've lived and worked in 4 different countries. And then beginning of last year, I came back to India for this role of Chief of Supply Chain for Apollo Tyres, which is a $3.2 billion company headquartered in the North region in a place called Gurgaon, which is close to Delhi. And we are in the business of tires. We have an Indian brand called Apollo, and we also have acquired a Dutch company and a Dutch brand called Friedestein, which is more famous in Europe. And we do have 5 manufacturing sites in India and a couple of them in Europe. And I'm responsible for the supply chain for Apollo Tyres, and I'm really happy to be coming back to India after almost 15 plus years living abroad, and happy to be in this journey of transformation for Apollo Supply Chain.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Can you tell me, earlier in your career, what was some of the advice that you personally were given by some of your mentors that has stayed with you throughout your career?
I'll tell you a funny story, Sam. This is like 22, 23 years ago, before I joined Beiersdorf, and I was working for Johnson & Johnson. And back in the day, I used to be quite good with computers, and I used to do my own little bit of programming, Visual Basic and Power, auto VLOOKUPs and stuff. And I used to be pedantic about planning. And I'm a planner. So if you ask me, I was very, very particular about the data and the numbers that we use. So invariably, it so happened that I used to keep a lot of this information to myself, and I used to do this because I was very picky about my files. And I remember going on vacations with my 1-year-old daughter and my wife, and I used to wake up early in the morning to do my planning runs in my whole file, downloading from SAP, making my own pivot, and all of that stuff that a typical planner does. And then I used to hand it over to my team before going on my sightseeing trips during the course of the day. And then I used to come back, and I used to again log in after my wife went back to sleep, and I used to work until midnight. So this was my routine every vacation. At one point in time, one of my managers asked me that, why are you working when you're on vacation? And that kind of dropped a penny. And I said, because I can't delegate this to my team. They said, that's what you think. If you want to grow in your life, you need to be able to train your people, train your team, and delegate these, and let them make mistakes. I was afraid that my team would not probably do it well, and they would make mistakes and things like that. And I'm a perfectionist, by the way. So for me, that was very important. And that helped me to unlock some of my own beliefs. And then I came back from vacation, and I used to start training them on different elements. I taught them how to do downloads from SAP and convert the CSV file into Excel. And somebody, I taught them about how to work with emails, with customers and things like that. So essentially, I kind of made myself redundant. So when I made myself redundant, that's when I realized that I can do far more value-adding activities and tasks, like talking to customers, visiting them, improving the quality of our SNOP and things like that. So that helped me in unlocking a lot of belief that I had. That was one of very good advice I got 25 years ago in my career, when I was just becoming, when I first time became a team manager, because I was promoted very early in my life from an individual contributor to a manager. And that was the first unlock that I had. That was the advice which I was given by my leader. And the second advice was very late in my life when I became a vice president. And then I realized that I have to learn to be comfortable with not knowing everything. Because until then, I knew more than my team, right? In terms of their job, in terms of their processes, their output and everything. But when I became the first time VP, I had to trust the team. I had to know who are the people that you need to have who know their stuff. I might not necessarily need to know everything. And you need to be comfortable with that aspect as well, that if you don't know the answer to a particular question, you can always say, let me check and come back. I was very insecure in the past when I did not know the answer to a question at my fingertips. And this was another learning. So one of my coaches actually explained to me the employee life cycle, like the way we have product life cycle in supply chain. An employee life cycle, he oversimplified it now. He said there are 3 phases in an employee life cycle. First, you're an individual contributor. Then the first time you become a team manager, where you are a sum total of all the output of your team, where you will know them and you actually guide them and you mentor them. And the third phase is the most difficult phase, where a lot of leaders fail, is when you move from a manager level to a leader level. And there is these 3 phases of your employee life cycle are extremely interesting. And unless you're able to let go of your past ways of working, leading or dealing with people, from a subject matter expertise to being a guide, a mentor, and who understands whom to ask a particular question if you do not have the answer to that question. So that's basically the evolution that you need to make if you want to succeed at your leadership role. So these were 2 different sets of advices I got at 2 different sets of in 2 different phases of my life.
No, brilliant. Thank you. I think particularly early in the career, I hear that a lot. It's quite hard to let go of that direct management piece. You really want to oversee things, but I'm sure you'll be able to attest that the further up the org you go, the more you have to let go of that. And, once you reach the level you're at today, you have to delegate almost everything because you're a business leader at this point. You can't run everything within the supply chain. You have to entrust that to your team and just be able to lead from the top. So I think thinking about that early on gives you the foundation to be able to do that. Could you tell me, look, you've obviously worked across a number of geographies. I mentioned at the beginning, but you've worked in Germany for a large part of your career, for India for a large part of your career, but also in Russia, in Dubai. How do you feel that this experience has helped you to grow and develop as a leader to where you are today?
That's a good question, Sam. I mean, having worked in multiple geographies and having led and managed people from different cultures, I think one thing that stands out quite, apart is no matter which part of the world you go to, people are inherently the same. People want to be heard. People want to be appreciated. People want to be coached, and people want to be led. Those 4 things remain the same no matter which country, which part of the world you live in. Of course, there are nuances about how would a German team react to a particular thing or versus a Russian or a Middle Eastern group of people. So I'll give you another story. The first time I was expatriated from India, way back in 2009, 2010, when I landed in Hamburg, my former boss in India, who was a German, and he thought I was far more German than Germans. I was very punctual, very strategic, and very organized, and all of that. He said, "You need to loosen up a little bit, Pai. You need to be, 5 minutes of delay here and there, 1 or 2 days. It's okay, In Germany, we call this akademische Viertel, which means if you have a private invitation for dinner or something, don't turn up at 7 o'clock sharp. 15 minutes is okay, So those were certain, advices which I got. At the same time, he told me one very interesting, very, very important advice is unlearn your Indian ways of leading people or managing people. Because in India, sometimes you have to do a little bit more follow-up to the extent that Germans might find it micromanaging. So he advised me to, once you give a task to your German team, they will come back by themselves if they can do it on that particular time or not. So that's one thing which he advised me. And that helped me. That advice, even today, helps me a lot when I deal with different cultural people, and in Germany particularly, it helped me a lot. So, so to come back to your question, the point is every culture will teach you one or the other thing. Now, when I'm here in this global role, it helps me to understand the perspectives of, if I have a lot of people in Netherlands in my team, so it helps me to deal with them because I've obviously worked with the Germans. So no matter where you go, you need to really unlearn some of your past ways of doing things and learn new things. And as you keep growing, you obviously, these become a part of your personality. You adapt and you are much more, versatile in dealing with multicultural people.
No, brilliant. It's great advice. And I think, especially if you want to step into a global role in the future, there's no real replacement for that on the ground experience, being in a market for multiple years, really learning the nuance. I'm sure you can attest to the fact it makes it that much easier now to manage people in the Netherlands and in Europe, as you say, because you've spent so much time doing it on the ground yourself. If we move away from that and more to supply chain as a whole, that we all know supply chain is changing a lot at the moment with technology and all the differences that we have. What do you think are some of the most important skills that the supply chain leaders of the future should be looking to develop today?
If you talk about skills, I would broadly categorize them under 3 buckets. And no matter whether it's if you're starting off in supply chain or if you're in the middle management career of in your life cycle, you essentially need to have all of these 3 skills in different proportions of each other, depending on your, hierarchy in the way you're growing. The first one is functional skills, core functional skills. You need to know if you are a supply chain person, if you come from the manufacturing side of things, or if you come from the supply chain side of things, you need to know your basics. If you're a plumber, you need to know your demand planning. You need to know how the whole ecosystem works. Or if you're a manufacturing person, you need to know how the operations work in the factory. So no matter what, and that is something in your first 10 years, 15 years of your career, you need to become an expert of that. And that will hold steady, and that will become your foundation for your future supply chain growth, no matter which area you come from. So that's the core functional skills. The second skills which you need to keep learning as you go along in the corporate journey is, I would say, leadership skills. And I'm overgeneralizing leadership skills. It could be in the early days of your career, the ability to present, the ability to influence without authority, the ability to synthesize a lot of information into meaningful nuggets for your leadership. And those skills in different varied proportions you need to also acquire. If you're a nerd, you will not grow in the supply chain career. So you need to have this functional skills and the leadership skills. Leadership skills could be multiple, you could give different colors to it. Conflict management skills, storytelling skills, analytical skills, all of that, I bundle it under one. And the third most important skill in today's time, especially, is digital skills. And digital skills back in the day when I started in the early 90s was ability to do more out of the tools that was given to you. Excel into pivot and now that's become Power BI and all of that. But today's digital skills is also about being curious to learn about AI and the AI use cases that are relevant for your business. So no matter, and this could be the flavor of the season. 10 years ago, it was blockchain. Prior to that, it was something else. So my point being, digital skills are something that you also need to constantly learn and adapt and keep adapting and keep improving and keep implementing and learning. So oversimplified, functional skills, core, nobody can take it away from you. Building that along with leadership skills, analytical skills, presentation skills. And the third is digital skills. So if you have these three skills constantly refreshed, you will not become a redundant person of the team anymore. So you will continue to learn and grow.
I think it's a great point. I think so many people touch on the digital side, AI, all these new emerging technologies. Firstly, that doesn't really matter if you don't have the foundational understanding of the function and leadership, but also you're right. These things change so quickly that 10 years ago it was blockchain. Today it's AI. I don't think anyone's going to deny it's an important technology that's going to change the industry, but that doesn't mean there's not more coming down the pipeline. That doesn't mean there's not more that needs to be sort of looked at. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. What advice would you give to someone who is just starting out their career in supply chain?
I always tell my freshers and people who've just finished their management trainee program and you're just starting off in their career is a lot of the people stop learning after they come out of business school or engineering college. They start working and they assume that they will continue to learn and grow in the job. And that's the biggest myth in life, right? What I personally believe is if you as a youngster in the industry is not investing in yourself, in your own learning and development, you are doomed for failure. Or you will not grow. Forget failure. You will not grow. The point is you will probably be stuck in your role and then you will probably retire at that. The point what I tell people is constantly learn, constantly try to unlearn if you've grown in your career, then unlearn what you've learned and learn new skills. Challenge the status quo. If you are a fresh blood in the system, and you've learned far newer things than when I graduated back in the day, right? So you bring better skills to the table. You bring better, competencies to the table. What are you afraid of? Challenge the status quo. Speak up. One of the things which I always tell youngsters is, don't be afraid of hierarchy. Challenge the status quo. Speak up. What could happen? What worse could happen? Somebody would say, shut up, this is a stupid idea. We've tried this. Okay, fine, move on. So that's one advice I will give to youngsters, that please don't be afraid. Challenge the status quo, bring your new skills to the table. And in that process, you will learn a lot of things. How to influence your managers, how to influence your leaders. And that's also a skill which is not necessarily taught in business school.
Yeah.
And that's something which I always tell people. And I always tell, the other advice which I always tell young potential candidates is seek for mentors. there might be people in your life whom you would have met who would have inspired you in some form or the other. Look out for those people, ask them if they would be happy to mentor you. And people like me, we always like to mentor youngsters so that we can give them some words of wisdom or from our experiences, from the mistakes we've made, so that they can learn from it. So continuously look for mentors who could, give you advice of how to position yourself. And then at the end of the day, you need to have somebody who's going to root for you. Within the organization as well, you need people who would be also be interested in your growth. So find your own, I wouldn't call them godfathers or godmothers, but somebody who's your ambassador, who wants to push for your growth. So that's the other part I would give, mentoring from an impartial person who's not having bias in your thing. And the other thing is internally find in your own leadership team somebody who's investing in your growth. So that's the two other piece of advice which I would give to people as well.
Brilliant. No, thank you. And then on the other side of things, what advice would you give to someone who is a vice president, a senior vice president? They're one step away from taking a C-suite role. What advice would you give to that person?
So in many organizations, there's only one chief supply chain officer. And invariably, the competition is intense at that level. If you're a part of a group of people who's being developed for succession planning. Now, very often than not, there are organizations where you might not get that coveted C-suite position. So what? I always tell people, so what? I always would advise that be fearless, believe in yourself, and look outside if that organization you don't have an opportunity immediately. So, and if you are ambitions to become a chief supply chain officer. So that's what I would recommend. So it's pretty, if you do not get that position within the same company, you would always have this element of self-doubt. I'm not good enough. This is pretty normal. We are humans, and it is pretty normal to have that self-doubt. But the only advice I would give is don't take yourself too seriously. If not this company, somewhere else.
No, amazing advice, particularly as a headhunter. That's the sort of advice we love to hear. So, no, I think that it's true. These are incredibly competitive roles. There's a competitive internal pipeline, external bench. You've got to have your name in the market. You've got to have your network, and you've got to be ready when that opportunity comes up, because they're not easy jobs to get. They're not easy jobs to do. But once you're in them, it becomes easier to continue. So, no, look, I think there's some awesome advice in there. Some really, really good bits of sort of advice and some stories. And I really appreciate you sharing. So thank you so much for taking the time. And yeah, really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.